Hi there, and welcome to Storytime with Kay. Today we will read Pick a Pumpkin, Mrs. Millie by Judy Cox and illustrated by Joe Mathieu. This book was published by Two Lions in 2012. Mrs. Millie, our teacher, is really silly. "Good morning, class," she says. "It's nice to see you." "It's nice to see you too, Mrs. Millie," we say. "Today we are going to the pumpkin pets," Mrs. Millie tells us. "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean the pumpkin patch." "We'll pick pumpkins for our harvest party and bring them yak to school." "No," we shout. "You mean back to school." We line up to get on the bus. "It's cold today," Mrs. Millie says. "Don't forget your jackals." "You mean our jackets?" we asked, giggling. At the farm, Farmer Don greets us at the gate. "We'll go on a hayride," says Mrs. Millie. "Everybody on the dragon." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean the wagon." The hayride takes us down the road. "Look," called Mrs. Millie, "a harecrow." "We know what you mean, a scarecrow," we tell her. We climb off the wagon and run into the field. "Be sure to pick a pig one," calls Mrs. Millie. "Mrs. Millie, you mean a big one." We made it through the muddy field. "Look for round orange pumas," called Mrs. Millie. "Pumpkins," we shout. After everyone has found a pumpkin, we load them into the wagon. "Now we will visit the barn," says Mrs. Millie. "You can be the animals." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean see the animals." We feed the horses. We toss grain to the chickens. Mrs. Millie takes a picture of the pigs. "Time to pet the boats," she says, smiling. "Silly Mrs. Millie, you mean the goats." Mrs. Millie pets a billy. "Let's help Farmer Don snake the leaves," says Mrs. Millie. "You're so silly," we cry. "You mean rake the leaves." We jump into the pile of leaves. "I spy a corn maze," says Mrs. Millie. "Who wants to play hide and sheep?" "Hide and seek, Mrs. Millie," we yell. "Ready for some hot apple cider?" asks Mrs. Millie. "You mean apple cider," we say. "How can you be so silly?" Finally, it's time to leave. "We'll take our pumpkins back to Mule," says Mrs. Millie. "We know what you mean. Back to school," we shout. "You can carve them into gecko-lanterns." "Silly Mrs. Millie, you mean jack-o'-lanterns," we tell her. "Wasn't the pumpkin patch fun?" Mrs. Millie says as we line up for the bus. "Yes, Mrs. Millie, we had fun," we shout. Farmer Don loads our pumpkins into the bus. "Thank you," we tell them. As the bus pulls away, we wave goodbye to Farmer Don and his billy boats. The end. Thank you for reading along. Be sure to rate and follow my page for new episodes posted daily.